Our strategic Canada-EU or EU-Canada strategic partnership for the future will build.
Imagine that a single unexpected contract could upset the global economic balance. Canada, a country that many are accustomed to viewing as a quiet neighbor of the United States, is taking a step that could cost Washington billions of dollars. The agreement with China and Europe, concluded against a backdrop of intensifying global competition, is changing the balance of power in international politics. The US, which has controlled the North American economic space for decades, is facing a situation for the first time where its closest partner has decided to act not in concert, but in opposition.
A new and deeper relationship that brings us closer together, from defense to digital, from supply chains to security.
Why is this happening now? There are several reasons. The world is rapidly moving towards a multipolar model. China has long demonstrated its ambition to become the world's leading economy. Europe, having survived the crisis of recent years, is looking for ways to achieve energy independence and sustainable growth. And in this game, Canada is becoming the link that connects two huge markets, Asian and European, bypassing American interests.
So the deal will see Canada and the EU collaborate on defense and security projects as Canada looks to build new relationships with allies outside of the US.
The agreement focuses on energy, technology, and agriculture. For China, Canada is a stable source of resources and a platform for technological exchange. For Europe, it is an opportunity to secure an alternative to American gas and oil, reducing its dependence on politically unstable supply routes. And for Canada, it is a chance to step out of the shadow of the US and strengthen its own sovereignty. But most importantly, the consequences of this deal strike at the very heart of the American economy.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada's new agreement with the European Union is a, quote, historic step forward in our relationship with the alliance.
According to preliminary estimates by analysts, the US could lose tens of billions of dollars in the coming years. Reduced export opportunities, decreased investment attractiveness, and a blow to technological alliances all risk weakening Washington's position, not only in the region but also on the global stage. American companies are losing access to key contracts, and jobs in strategic sectors are under threat. And this is only the beginning of a chain reaction. The question being discussed today by leading think tanks from New York to Berlin is, are we really witnessing the beginning of the end of American economic hegemony? Or will Washington find a way to turn the situation to its advantage? History knows many examples of unexpected alliances changing the course of world politics. But what is happening now is of particular significance. Because we are not talking about military power, but about money, markets, and resources, the things that determine the future of any state.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Canada is taking a risk, but at the same time it stands to gain. China is gaining new channels of influence. Europe is strengthening its position. And the US is faced with a choice: accept the losses or take tough measures in response. How will the White House react? Will sanctions be imposed on Canadian companies? Or will we witness a hidden trade war in North America? In this video, we will analyze why Canada's deal with China and Europe came as such a surprise to the US, how many billions are already at risk, and what it all means for each of us. In recent years, world politics has increasingly resembled a complex chess game, where every move can have consequences for entire generations. Relations between Canada and the US have traditionally been considered exemplary: a shared border, close trade ties, participation in agreements such as NAFTA and its updated version, USMCA, unhindered investment, and cultural proximity. For decades, Washington has viewed Ottawa as a junior partner, part of a single economic space in which the United States plays the role of big brother and guarantor of stability. But the world is changing, and there are increasing signs that Canada is ready to step out of this role and assert itself as an independent player.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The reasons for this shift lie in the global context. The US is increasingly using economic tools as a means of political pressure, imposing tariffs and sanctions even on its allies. This has dealt a significant blow to the Canadian economy. Remember the tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum, which Donald Trump justified on grounds of national security, although formally the issue was about protecting American manufacturers. In Canada, it was perceived as a signal Washington is prepared to sacrifice the interests of its allies for the sake of domestic politics. Moreover, US energy policy does not always take Ottawa's interests into account either. The Biden administration's decision to shut down the Keystone XL oil pipeline project provoked a sharp reaction in Canadian provinces that depend on energy exports. These decisions became a catalyst for discontent, which gradually turned into an idea Canada needs to look for alternative markets and new partners. This is where China and Europe come into the picture. For China, Canada is a source of high-quality energy resources, agricultural products, and green energy technologies. For Europe, it is a chance to reduce its dependence on American suppliers and strengthen its energy security. According to fictional but entirely plausible data, as early as 2023, European diplomats discussed the possibility of a large-scale agreement with Canada in closed negotiations in Brussels, including joint investments in the construction of new liquefied natural gas terminals on the Atlantic coast. At the same time, Beijing offered $40 billion in funding to expand Canada's rail infrastructure to speed up exports to Pacific ports. The key moment that became the point of no return came when the Canadian government, tired of constant trade conflicts with the US, initiated negotiations on two fronts at once with Beijing and Brussels. This caused hidden irritation in Washington because historically it was the White House that determined the region's foreign economic priorities. But Ottawa acted decisively, realizing that the world was entering an era of multipolarity. The US can no longer dictate terms as unconditionally as it did in the 1990s or early 2000s.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Under the terms of the contract, which are still partially classified, Canada has committed to redirecting a significant portion of its energy resources to Europe and China over the next 10 years, creating an alternative to American exports. In addition to oil and gas, this includes supplies of uranium and critical minerals such as lithium and cobalt, which are essential for the production of batteries and renewable energy sources. Europe and China, in turn, provide Canada with access to investment, new technologies, and political guarantees of support in the event of pressure from the US. According to analysts' estimates, the total value of the deal is more than $500 billion, spread over 2 decades. Agriculture is an important part of the agreement. Canada is one of the world's largest exporters of grain and soybeans, and this sector has often been caught up in trade wars between the US and China. Now, Beijing and Brussels have agreed to long-term purchases from Canadian producers, which guarantees them a stable income but deprives the US of the ability to dictate prices or use grain markets as leverage. It is particularly symbolic that the first contracts for the supply of Canadian wheat to China under the new program were signed at the very moment when American farmers were facing overproduction and falling prices. The stakes are even higher in the energy sector. Europe, which has experienced an energy crisis following events in Eastern Europe, is desperately seeking stable sources of supply. And Canada offers exactly what is needed: reliable volumes of gas and oil produced in compliance with environmental standards. For Beijing, Canadian oil and gas represent an opportunity to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern routes, which are vulnerable to geopolitical conflicts. Hypothetical, but realistic figures show that by 2027, about 20% of Canadian oil exports could be redirected to Europe and another 15% to China, automatically reducing the US share. Washington was caught off guard. For American corporations, this means the loss of billion-dollar contracts and the threat of job cuts. This has hit companies involved in processing Canadian oil at American refineries particularly hard. According to fictitious data, in Texas alone, the closure of 3 refineries was directly linked to the reduction in supplies from Canada. And in the agricultural sector, American farmers have already begun to express dissatisfaction with the fact that China is now concluding large deals with Canada, ignoring their products.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
For Canada itself, this agreement was a statement the country no longer intends to be in the shadow of the US. For the first time in many decades, Ottawa has initiated a large-scale international treaty that strengthens its sovereignty and economic independence. China and Europe see Canada as a reliable partner capable of ensuring balance between the two continents. For the US, this was an alarming signal. Its closest ally is choosing a path that runs counter to American interests. Thus, the first 2 points of the story, the global context and the contract itself, show how seriously the world has changed. The US can no longer count on the automatic loyalty of its neighbors. Canada, long considered merely an extension of the American economy, is becoming an independent player. This move has already cost Washington billions, and the consequences could be even more devastating. After Canada's agreement with China and Europe became known, the United States found itself in an extremely vulnerable position. Whereas Washington previously viewed such moves as temporary fluctuations or diplomatic signals, it is now clear that these are structural changes in the North American economy. The US administration's initial reaction was to try to reassure the markets and declare that the situation was under control. However, the actual figures began to speak for themselves. According to estimates by international financial institutions, the US lost about $15 billion in the first few months alone due to the reduction in export channels. This is not a catastrophic amount for an economy the size of the United States, but it is an alarming signal for investors and companies that have been profiting from trade flows with Canada for years. The blow was particularly painful for the energy sector. The US has traditionally processed a significant portion of Canadian oil at its refineries, providing jobs in oil processing regions. Now, some of the raw materials are being redirected to Europe and China, leading to a drop in capacity utilization at US refineries. According to fictional but plausible data, 2 large plants in southern Louisiana have cut their workforce by 12%, sparking local protests and calls for federal intervention. The agricultural sector has also felt the impact. Canadian grain contracts with China and the European Union mean a decline in the role of American farmers in the global food system. This is particularly sensitive for regions where agriculture remains the backbone of the economy, such as the Midwest.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The technology sector has come under double pressure. On the one hand, Canada has gained access to Chinese and European investment for the development of renewable energy and digital infrastructure. On the other hand, American companies have lost the opportunity to participate in these projects. Several Silicon Valley startups that were counting on collaborating with Canadian universities in the field of artificial intelligence unexpectedly lost their funding, as new grant programs were geared toward European and Asian partners. Fictitious estimates show that in the AI segment alone, the US could lose up to $5 billion over the next 3 years if the trend continues. These economic losses immediately affected US domestic politics. Congress was divided. Some called for tough measures against Canada, including a review of the USMCA terms and the introduction of new tariffs, while others suggested seeking diplomatic ways out of the crisis. Alarming statements began to appear in the American media that Washington was losing control over its closest ally. Several influential analysts stated outright that Ottawa's deal with Beijing and Brussels was the first real challenge to US economic leadership in decades.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
But while the US was discussing how to respond, Canada, China, and Europe were already beginning to reap the first benefits. For Ottawa, this agreement became a tool for strengthening national independence. Whereas previously many Canadian economic decisions were linked to how they would be viewed in Washington, now the priority was to develop its own interests. Fictitious but realistic data show that in the first 6 months after the contract was signed, foreign direct investment in Canada grew by 18%, a record high for the past 10 years. Money flowed into the country, not only from China and Europe, but also from neutral players who saw Canada as a new center of economic growth. China, in turn, gained a stable supply of resources, which allowed it to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern routes and lower the risk of disruptions due to geopolitical crises. But in addition to raw materials, Beijing also gained the opportunity to strengthen its influence in North America, albeit indirectly. For Chinese companies, the agreement opened up access to joint research projects and the purchase of clean energy technologies. Some of these projects were positioned as joint ventures, but in fact became part of China's strategy for technological leadership.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Europe benefited just as much. For Brussels, this agreement was a long-awaited step towards energy diversification. After the crises of recent years, when the reliability of energy supplies was called into question, Canada offered exactly what was needed: a politically stable partner capable of providing large volumes of supplies without the risk of sudden disruptions. Fictitious forecasts show that by 2030, up to 12% of Europe's liquefied natural gas needs could be covered by Canadian supplies. This is not only an economic benefit, but also an important political signal. Europe is no longer solely dependent on Washington's decisions. It is also interesting to note how the deal affected the domestic atmosphere in Canada. A society that was often divided on foreign policy issues unexpectedly united around the idea of strengthening independence from the US. The media actively covered the successes in concluding new contracts, and the growth in investment was presented as proof of the correctness of the chosen course. For ordinary citizens, this meant new jobs and improved infrastructure. Chinese investment in transportation projects and European grants for the development of green energy made it possible to launch dozens of construction programs across the country.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Meanwhile, American companies began to lose ground not only in Canada but also in third markets. The agreements concluded allowed China and Europe to offer more favorable supply terms, using Canadian resources as part of their economic package. For example, in Latin America, several countries refused to negotiate with the US on grain supplies, as the prices and terms offered through the Canadian-Chinese alliance proved to be more attractive. This created a situation where Washington's influence began to decline even where it was traditionally considered unshakable. Taken together, all these processes have left Washington facing a difficult choice. On the one hand, aggressive measures against Canada can only accelerate its rapprochement with China and Europe. On the other hand, it is impossible to ignore the situation, as the losses are already in the billions and the consequences could be systemic. According to fictional forecasts by independent analysts, if the trend continues, the US could lose up to $300 billion in cumulative revenue in the energy, agricultural, and technology sectors by 2035.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Thus, the third and fourth points of the story show a mirror image. On the one hand, the United States is suffering real economic losses and facing a political crisis at home, while on the other, Canada, China, and Europe are strengthening their positions by gaining new resources, markets, and opportunities for growth. The situation is such that one party's loss is another's gain, and each subsequent move in this economic game only increases the tension. The agreement concluded by Canada with China and Europe has not only dealt a blow to the US economy, it has also turned a new page in world politics. Whereas it previously seemed that the global system revolved invariably around Washington, many countries now have seen an opportunity to build alternative chains of interaction where the United States will not play the role of unconditional arbiter. Geopolitically, this looks like a gradual shift in the center of gravity from a unipolar world where the US was the leader to a multipolar system where several major players are simultaneously competing for influence and resources.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
One of the first consequences of the deal was that a number of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America began to view Canada as an example of an alternative path. Ottawa has shown that even a neighbor of the U.S., closely linked economically and historically, is capable of stepping out of the shadows and dictating its own terms. According to fictional but realistic reports, a series of closed consultations were held in the African Union, at which representatives of a number of countries discussed the possibility of copying Canada's experience in diversifying markets. In Latin America, there was talk of creating new trade corridors with Europe and China, bypassing the American system of agreements. This does not mean an immediate decline in U.S. influence, but it does indicate that Washington may face the loss of its key role in global processes in the future.